Welcome to Film Trace. This is the podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production all the way to release and reception. What do we have today, Chris? I guess I chose this, so I'll introduce it.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm choosing the new films, and Chris is choosing the older films. I chose Hubie Halloween, the new Sandlerverse film that premiered on Netflix this last Wednesday. What's with the Wednesday release?
Yeah, I thought they were trying to bury it, but now, I mean, it's number one on Netflix.
It's number one. So. People love it. So a little context here. In choosing the new films, it's a little bit tough because there's not new stuff coming out at the box office, really. There's some stuff, but not a lot. And I'm not going to go see it. And you're not either, right? So
correct.
We're just looking at VOD stuff. Like a lot of foreign films were out there, and I just like nothing really grabbed my attention. And there's nothing out there that I wanted to dive into. And I saw Hubie Halloween, and I was like, no, we're not doing that. Absolutely not. We're not going to do that film. And then I kept looking and looking. Then I was like, well, wait a second. Like, if we want to have a good, interesting conversation, then I think people will be, it'll be entertaining to listen to, and they're probably going to watch it. It's going to be Hubie Halloween because there's so much. I think there's a lot to talk about, less about the film and more about like what goes on behind the scenes and what Adam Sandler's all about. I don't know. There's like a deep sea to dive into here for me. I don't know. What did you think when I chose this film? I was very nervous.
I thought you went off the deep end, but I kind of resigned myself to the fact that eventually we would have to be covering an Adam Sandler Netflix movie, because I know that you have a strange fascination with not just Adam Sandler in general, and like, I mean, fair warning, you're talking to two guys in their mid-30s, and so we both grew up on a steady diet of Billy Madison and Happy Gilmore.
Absolutely.
And I have no regrets. Yeah. But so many of us, myself included, have written him off essentially since the Netflix deal, because it just seems like such a trove of bottom feeder garbage.
Yeah.
But I know that like the business side of this, especially with the Sony email leaks, which I'm sure you'll get into, makes this for a rather interesting foray into the industry side of things, even if the movies themselves barely qualify as interesting.
Oh, no. I mean, I think, Hubie Halloween is not going to be that different than most of the stuff that he makes. It's kind of a factory over there now at Netflix. But yeah, I think that the big sort of piece to bite down on here is the industry stuff. And like, how did this happen? Like, how did Adam Sandler become, I don't know, maybe the most powerful man in like American comedy? Can I call him that? Is that possible? Yeah. I mean, his movies have made billions upon billions of dollars. He can do whatever he wants. And I just think it's a fascinating story to think about, especially because we're approaching 40. And when he was big, not only with the Billy Madison and Happy Gilmore stuff, back when we were like, what, teenager? Were we teenagers, like early teens, or like late children? Whatever it's like late children. Is that term?
No, it was perfect timing. I think we probably had both just turned 13.
Yes,
when exactly. Billy Madison was released.
And then obviously this SNL stint, which I don't know if younger people do. The younger people know that he was on SNL and like know his stuff from SNL. I don't know because I'm not around children ever. No, but I feel like it might be lost. I don't know. Do your kids know who Adam Sandler is outside of movies? My students kind of know Adam Sandler just as the like, stupid comedy guy. There's so few teenagers nowadays that care about SNL. If they do, it's inherited from their parents, which is kind of depressing. Yeah, that's true. And so, he's just had such a fascinating career. So I think, I don't know, let's start out by just talking about, Adam Sandler, like a brief overview of his career, a super brief overview, and then walking into sort of Happy Madison Productions and how that started. Adam Sandler, he grew up in New Hampshire, was kind of a weird arty kid. Went to, I didn't know this. He went to NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, which kind of blows my mind because there's a very specific stereotype. There's a great quote from some article. Basically, it said he wound up at NYU's Tisch School of Arts, a Caddyshack fan among the bicycle thieves types, which I think is actually a really apt description of him to some degree. So he does that, gets into comedy in New York, moves out to Los Angeles. And a very sort of lucky situation here. Dennis Miller sees him and says, wow, this guy's great. He recommends him to Lorne Michaels. Lorne Michaels brings him on as a writer in 1990. The next year, he becomes a featured player on SNL. And then he does all his skits and stuff like that. And then 5 years later, and it's never really clear what happened to him and Chris Farley in 1995. It sounds like they were fired, but like they didn't know they were fired. They just didn't get re-signed or something. Lorne Michaels always sort of fires people that way, where he doesn't say, hey, you're fired. He just says, you're not coming back. Or like he doesn't re-sign them essentially. So he gets kicked off that show, and that's when he starts his movie career. But he doesn't really take off in terms of his biggest two movies in that sort of early period would be Wedding Singer and Waterboy in 1998. And then what essentially happened then is actually at the promotion for, I think, Waterboy, he meets the head of Sony Studios, Amy Pascal, and they kind of hit it off. And she basically gives him Big Daddy, and that's how the relationship starts. And they basically says, hey, come to Sony. Come to our sort of studio and we'll get you set up with your own production company. And that's how Happy Madison essentially started. So it's kind of a weird sort of, super into comedy, gets a lucky break on the SNL, and then, makes a couple of big movies and then meets up with Amy Pascal. And then all of a sudden he's got this fiefdom that he has created over the years. Did you know, before looking at this stuff, did you know how closely linked he was to Sony and how important that was to his whole sort of shtick in his world?
Only tangentially. And when those Sony leaks happened with the whole North Korea, the interview thing, I think the Sandler stuff was pretty buried in comparison to a lot of the other stuff that had come up from it. And, it was clear that obviously this is not a guy, at least back then, that really had much of wherewithal about what he was doing with this movie career, right? It was largely, producer driven, and maybe even more writer driven. And he's got a writing credit on a lot of his stuff, but it ultimately seems like mostly, a reputation thing. Maybe he's, throws a few jokes the actual writer's way, but I don't see Sandler doing much of actually like hunkering over final draft. And maybe that's, maybe that's a stretch. I don't know. I
don't think so at all.
So it really does seem like he had the personality, he had the fame, and he just let everybody else basically do the work. And so that's how you kind of get stuck in those relationships in Hollywood, right? Between like him and Pascal. So he was pretty much trapped. And then when, the tides turned on him, when do you think that happened? When did it no longer become a box office draw to see Sandler top billed?
I think it was Jack and Jill is what a lot of people trace that to, which is an infamous movie. I think 2011, and I think it came out in 2011. That's the one where he plays himself and also his sister. And then Al Pacino's in that, and it's like a Dunkin' Donuts promotion essentially for 2 hours. That's when the returns, also within those the email leaks, there's sort of, you can tell that there was this growing rebellion against Sandler at Sony. Like, I think a lot of the employees didn't like that they were putting out this really schlocky, terrible, lowbrow comedies, and so I think that pissed off a lot of people. And you got to remember, like, the Hollywood world's usually filled with creative types who, like, they're in business and they want to make money, but they're also went to art school. And they also have some semblance of like taste. And so like having to like create this Adam Sandler factory where they're just pushing out this like lowbrow stuff just was did not excite them. And so that was building, but it was really when the financial picture started to change. So Jack and Jill did make money, but it only made money because of overseas, specifically places like Brazil. They loved it. In the States, it didn't do that well. And then after that, his movies sort of, they started to, He's My Boy, I think, was the first movie that Sony basically said, no, we're not going to do this. Mm-hmm. And then Sandler was like, yeah, you are. And they got into a fight, and then Sony eventually said, yes, we will do this. And then it lost money. And I think from that point on, the relationship was essentially soiled on some level, and it was never really going to get better. Right. Pixels did okay. But it really came to a head when Sandler was have this ridiculous Six idea, this Western movie. Sony said no, and they didn't sort of back down. They said, we're not doing this. He took that then to Paramount, and then he also took it to, I think, Warner Brothers. They all passed. and said, we're not going to do this. And then Netflix came out of nowhere essentially and was like, we would love to do this movie. We would love to have you for multiple pictures. And that's when he signed that 2014 deal. So 4-movie deal with Netflix. And then he just re-signed this year in January, a new 4-movie deal worth about $300 million. So it's just, and there's in that deal and stuff in the last 4 years or last 4 movies and stuff like that. Have you seen any of those? Have you seen Ridiculous Six, the Do-Over, Murder Mystery? Have you seen any of those?
Not a single second. And to be honest, I haven't even seen, I'm looking at the filmography right around that time of Jack and Jill and That's My Boy. But then also like the Grown Ups movies are, I've never seen a second of those either, but those made more money than a lot of his movies combined. And also even a movie I completely forgot about, Blended, his third in the trilogy with Drew Barrymore, was also a big hit in 2014. Yeah.
And that was actually right when, so Warner Brothers did that movie. So that was like him already kind of leaving Sony at that point.
Gotcha.
But yeah, Grown Ups 2. Have you heard of the podcast, The Worst Idea Ever podcast? Have you ever heard of that?
No.
So their whole concept is I think it's two Australian guys. And basically they said, let's watch Grown Ups 2 once a week for a year and we'll do a podcast about it. So they watch it 52 times. It's hilarious. It's really funny. But what's the last Adam Sandler movie that you've seen in the theater?
That's a great question. We're gonna have to date it all the way back to Funny People. That doesn't largely even count because he wasn't a producer on that. Yeah. So I guess it was I Now Pronounce You Chuck and Larry. Back in
you saw it in the theaters? What's wrong with you?
It's clearly a lot of things.
I think the last one I saw in the theaters was probably Funny People. Yeah. And he was kind of all over the place for a while. 2014 is kind of an interesting year. It's funny you brought up Blended. Did you ever see The Cobbler?
No, that's the Thomas McCarthy movie, right?
Didn't he win Best Director or something, right? He did Spotlight.
For Spotlight, yeah.
Yeah. It's one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my life. The Cobbler. You should really check it out if you want to be like bummed out and be like, what is this? But essentially, Sandler is just, he's kind of all over the place, kind of on the downslope, essentially, in 2014. Then he gets this Netflix deal, has all these movies come out. Tell the audience about Hubie Halloween. What is this movie all about?
Yeah, so, what is it about? It's essentially the character from The Waterboy, but as a Halloween safety patrol person?
Yeah, I think that's right. And how old is he supposed to be?
It's hard to tell. So like Julie Bowen is his neighborhood love interest, right? Yeah. And so that's I had completely forgotten about this until I had read up on Hubie, but what other film was she in with him?
Happy
Gilmore.
Happy Gilmore, yeah.
Yes. And so it's kind of interesting that that's like a reteam, but also like Julie Bowen has grown so much more as an actor over the years compared to Sandler. Even if she's remained largely on the small screen, it's very strange to see like this guy in perpetual Arrested Development next to this pretty accomplished actor, and yet it really feels kind of like a low rent like gonzo version of a Modern Family episode, where essentially you have like this kind of sweet natured family story at the center of it, like community neighborhood story, but then it's just chock full of like dick gags and strange non-humor cameos that is just basically an excuse, as so many people have said before about Sandler's Netflix era, an excuse to basically pay his friends to like hang out and create something easy for a few weeks and maybe dodge some taxes. I know you've alluded to that possibility.
I can't remember where that came up. It's on some podcast where they talked about it. Like it's got to be, it's maybe the Red Letter Media. It might have been those guys talking about how like, and it really started around Grown Ups, where it was sort of like, hey, he just works with the same people, Kevin James, Rob Schneider, David Spade, Chris Rock, usually, Steve Buscemi, stuff like that sometimes. and they just basically choose a really cool place to go to. He admitted to this on an interview. I was watching, not the tax dodge part of it, but like he admitted at some Hubie Halloween interview that basically someone was like, hey, so you just kind of like get your friends together and just choose a place to go for a movie. And I forget where it started. It might have been Blended. I forget where one of them shot in Hawaii. And he was like, yeah, I just told the studio, like, what if we did this in Hawaii? And they're like, yeah, sure, that sounds good. And he's always done that.
Right.
And he's basically just like, hey, calls up all his friends. There's an idea. Where do you guys want to go? Let's go there. And they just convince the studio to do it because they think it's going to make money. So I don't think there's like any sort of nefarious, I think, thing going on here. It's just like he wants to kind of have fun with his friends and make a lot of money and go to a place he wants to be at. And that whole concept too is, I think, very foreign to a lot of people. And it almost kind of, it's a harken back to like a studio era, like a big studio era, like the 40s and 50s or something like that, where stars were that powerful. Where they could be like, oh, I'm going to go here with this group of people and make this. But back then it was more like the producer who was saying that. And Adam Sandler kind of has both roles. He's both the star and the star producer. So he has this enormous amount of power that he can throw around and get other people involved. And he always tends to make movies with the same people. Like this director, right, Steve Brill, and the writer, Tim Hurley, they've known him for forever. And it's almost like they don't have a career without Adam Sandler. And I think like that's like fascinating too. I mean, did you ever notice that, like even back maybe in the 90s, 2000s, that he always had the same group of people around him?
Yeah. I mean, it was definitely clear. I think that that was actually one of probably the early forms of like crystallization of like behind the scenes industry where it wasn't quite The Waterboy, because I remember I saw that on my birthday and I was puking my guts out. But it was maybe Little Nicky, where like I think it was Little Nicky, which actually I'm clicking it on Wikipedia, also directed by Steve Brill.
Yeah, dude, he's everywhere.
And like I remember watching that movie and it just having this strong just haze over it of just like, this feels like something that I would have made up with my friends like a few years ago, and I was already like 16 at the time, so it really much felt like so little effort was put into it. And then it just made the wheels in my head start turning, where it's like, oh yeah, SNL is just kind of like, especially in that time period with Sandler and Farley, had been like stereotyped as like, you know, frat boy central, where it's like you party and then you show up and improvise and break on camera for an hour and a half once a week. And it just seemed so much like this kind of deconstruction in my young mind of how little people actually cared about these things that were making hundreds of millions of dollars.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Like it, and you look back to like, even you're talking about SNL, the writer here, Tim Hurley, was Adam Sandler's roommate at NYU. He ends up becoming a writer on SNL. And then he stayed after Sandler left, rose to head writer, and then became eventually producer of SNL. He leaves in 99 and starts doing films. He did Happy Gilmore as the writer, Wedding Singer, Waterboy, Big Daddy, Little Nick. I don't even know half these movies. Mr. Deeds, do you remember that? I don't remember that.
Yeah,
Grown Ups 2, Pixels, like Ridiculous 6. It's just like this weird. I mean, it is very incestuous, right?
Yes.
But
it's also. It's not like, because there was also, I'm also thinking about like Moment of Crystallization around the same time of seeing like Royal Tenenbaums and like thinking how, Wes Anderson had a group but that was also seen as like an auteur thing for so many directors, right? Scorsese had a group and Woody Allen had a group. But for whatever reason, it never like gave any kind of indication, even on a comedy level, right? Like comedy can be smart. And I also really enjoy dumb comedy. And I really think that he struck gold a couple times in the 90s, especially with Billy Madison and The Wedding Singer.
Absolutely.
But there is such a, I don't know, it almost feels like a free pass to be like, oh, that's something that people in the movies do. So yeah, Sandler's going to do that. And also just like that cliquey nature of like the SNL cast and how it was, that so many bad SNL skit movies were made based off of that just networking and connections and the cliquey nature of that part of the industry. And so like what I'm curious about is when we look at this before we get into like the release stuff, when you see them create like specifically this movie, Hubie Halloween, I mean, there's not the destination factor. They're going to Salem, Massachusetts.
Salem, Massachusetts, the one and only.
So there's not really a lot of, they're not. He's not just getting his friends to go on a trip with him, right?
Yeah.
So what is if we're going on the cynical route of just like he's doing this to do as little as possible, like is there any actual like joy in movie making happening here? We know there's not depth, but is there any actual like there's a quote here, right, from Sandler himself where he says like his goal is to just work his ass off trying to make sure we're putting enough jokes in there and having the story make sense. Like is that him just like admitting to the bare minimum, or is that him just saying like this is workmanlike? This isn't like I'm trying to create something great, but I'm trying the best I know how, and I want to give the people what they want, which is laughter. Is that what's going on here?
I think ultimately what he's trying to do here is he's basically in no man's land, right? He wants to have this sort of production company. He wants to give all of his friends, and that group of friends has gotten massive over the years. Mm-hmm. He has a whole universe around him of super famous people as well are in this circle. He wants to sort of appease all of those people, bring them into movies. He's not trying to make great art, obviously. And I don't think he's even trying to make stuff funny at this point. I think he's trying to like, I don't even know what he's trying to do. Ultimately, what it feels like to me is he got into a pattern back in the late 90s that was very successful. It was this lowbrow, let's sort of hang out in the writer's room and come up with stupid stuff and we'll put it on screen and we'll do a lot of improv with my friends on set. And it worked and it kept working. And what happened at Sony is that the studio system, there's a lot of stuff involved there because the hack happened in 2014 as well. Right. So that didn't help the relationship, but they did pass on Ridiculous 6. He did present them Ridiculous 6. They said, no, absolutely not. And so did other studios. Right. So he hit a wall in 2014, 2015, let's say, where the sort of money train was stopping and no one was going to give him more money to greenlight his movies. I think there's a great part in the Sony email leaks where he demands $200 million to make Candyland, a live action version of Candyland, and Sony said no. And there was a great back and forth with the Sony executives and president about this. And they basically, the president of Sony Pictures says this explicitly. He basically says that Adam's angry because he's no longer the guy he used to be.
Yeah.
And I think that if Netflix had not come around, I think his career would be in a completely different situation. I think he'd be a lot more obviously down and out. I think he would not be making big movies with any studio. He might have gone back to comedy or TV or something like that. But it just was perfect timing that Netflix came along and basically said, we need your type of movie, which is kind of easy to watch, palatable, kind of dumb and entertaining, does not ask anything of the audience. Because what does Netflix want at the end of the day? They want eyeballs over a certain amount of time. They don't even want to entertain you. That's not their goal. Their goal is to get you to stick to the screen as long as possible. And Adam Sandler's movies were perfect for that. And Ted, whatever his name is, the head of content at Netflix, said that, out loud in an interview. His movies just kind of fit our vibe and our aesthetic. And that's why I find it so fascinating, because these aren't movies, are they? This isn't art. Like this is a product. Like this is like, I love comparing stuff to food because I think it's the easiest thing for people to understand. Like, what would this be if you could have any meal in the world and go out and eat someplace? What restaurant would this be? Is this like a Denny's? Or is this like a Applebee's or like an Outback Steakhouse? Like, what is this? Because it's not art.
No, it's IHOP. It's just sugar and carbs.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's interesting you think about that in terms of product, because essentially going back several years, especially with comedy, there's an interesting quote from Sandler where he says that when he was a kid, his favorite comedy was Abbott and Costello Meet Dracula and Frankenstein and the Wolfman. And so that seems to be a reference point for him for this. But there is an interesting like distinction here where even though, you know, film was nascent media back in that time period with the silent comedies of Charlie Chaplin and then, you know, the initial talkies of Abbott and Costello, there was still like an element of like actual skill, especially in terms of like stunt work, where there's a legitimate case to be made that a lot of those early comedy stars were not just innovating and creating a whole new genre, but they were also like legit like technical proficient acrobats. And you take a look at Hubie Halloween. I mean, how many times does he crash his bike and just like fall off the front? And that's the extent of any kind of stunt work. The dialogue is lazy. It once again, the voice he's using is recycled from one of his more successful films in the 90s. It just feels so lazy that it does not seem like he has reason to care because Netflix says it matches his aesthetic. And so it just kind of lives in this netherland of, people will put it on, like so many people have mentioned, especially in recent years, as something that they can have on the background while they fuck around on their phone. And that's pretty much it.
Yeah. I mean, that's all it is. And I think that's all that Netflix wants to be. What's mind blowing about Sandler to me, and I think one of the things that fascinates me most about him is that, you know, he was a very talented young comedian in the stand-up world. And that's how he got kind of his break with Dennis Miller and SNL. That wasn't, you know, on accident. He actually worked really hard and was very talented to do that part of it. But then he got inside sort of the palace and he got the keys to every room. And then basically he can make movies for the rest of his life. And this is what he's chosen to make. Like Hubie Halloween. Like he has all of the power, creative power in the world. And he chooses to make films like Grown Ups 2, Hubie Halloween, Ridiculous 6. There's something infuriating about that, right? There's something that is so perplexing that you think of all of the people that struggle with their art, whether they're in music or whatever, and they would to get $1,000 to make a movie would like blow somebody's mind who's like, you know, super into it and passionate.
Right.
And he uses all of that power to essentially make really terrible films. And we'll talk about the critical response here in a bit. It's like all of his films, they hate it. And the audiences actually don't love it that much either. But we keep watching it and consuming it. And it is mind blowing to me that Sandler, with all of that power, who could be helping, you know, artists who want to make something maybe a little bit different, or producing, edgier comedy, or get outside of comedy, do dramas and stuff like that. He has done a little bit of that, but not nearly as much as he probably could have. And that to me is what fascinates me the most about him. Like, why would he choose the path of least resistance here with all of the money and influence and power that he has? He could be, you know, nurturing young artists and being more of that type of person. He doesn't care, does he?
Yeah.
Like I don't know. I understand. It's mind blowing. I just don't get it.
We would be remiss to not mention the fact that he is a proven Republican. I mean, I feel like a lot of what you just mentioned like fits that type to a T. Like it's business and it's easy business. Why mess with it? He's comfortable. He doesn't care about anybody else, and his buddies are comfortable. So it's what it is.
There's also that weird double-edged part of it because everybody says that he's insanely loyal. That was like the one thing that came up in the profile of like Jennifer Aniston, Drew Barrymore, all these people like, oh, he's like the most loyal guy I've ever met, blah, blah, blah. But it's almost like it's my team and then everybody else can kind of screw off. Is kind of what it feels like. And there's a little bit of that in the Sony emails too, where he's like, I'm going to get my guy an extra $100K for being a producer on like Transylvania 1 or something like that. And then like Sony's like, what? No, the guy didn't do anything. It's like, there's that element, almost like I don't know, like club or team or almost like a gang type situation.
Which is probably why he does so well and natural in the tremendous work he did in Uncut Gems. Probably the pinnacle of his career.
And that's what makes another layer to that. He's so good in that.
Right.
Like in that role, he's amazing in that role. He deserved an Oscar nom, if not the win, for Best Actor that year. What was that, last year, I guess? Yeah.
Yeah.
It just like, but I think it does add a weird layer to that then. Like, how much is he acting there? Like,
he's just leaning into his worst impulses. Yeah.
What do the critics think about this? What do you got on that?
Yeah, well, honestly, you said it was bad, but I would have thought it would be worse. But it does seem like most people agree that this is not the worst of the batch when it comes to Netflix Sandler. Rotten Tomatoes, all critics got it at 50%, top critics 57% somehow, with average on Metacritic of 53. Like, that's just mediocre. I mean, maybe a little worse than mediocre. Usually you're somewhere in the 60s if you're mediocre on Rotten Tomatoes or Metacritic, but still, like, I can't imagine that I would mark it any higher than a 20. But
I'd give like a 33 maybe.
It's rough. Rotten Tomato audience score 56. Once again, even 1 percentage point less than the top critics.
That's what confuses me about that, though. Why do you think audiences are a little bit more timid on this than his other movies?
I think when it comes to comedies anyways, I'd imagine that just on like a base level, audiences are marking things based on how much it makes them laugh. And this is not a laugh out loud movie. I think I laughed once, and it was just at Tim Meadows probably improvising in the car, sucking on the fingers of his Halloween
I love
costume.
that scene. Yeah.
It's the only redeeming point of the entire film. Yeah. I mean, Tim Meadows, I mean, that's a guy I wish would also do more with his life.
I don't get that either. Tim Meadows I wish you could do a whole episode on Tim Meadows.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I don't get that. Like, he's so funny. Mean Girls.
So funny.
And, like,
he's so funny.
Oh my God.
But Letterboxd, the 50, even with like the rebirth of Sandler in the wake of Uncut Gems getting the film Twitter types all aflutter last year, I think that's probably a lot of holdover goodwill there. Why that's not lower, if nothing else. IMDb 53, Metacritic audience 56. It's just straight in the middle, and I think that's what he's aiming for.
Yeah,
I think this is pretty good. pretty good for what he's
for him.
trying
This
to
is
do.
I think it's better than Ridiculous 6. So I think had a 0 Rotten Tomato score.
Yikes.
Which I did watch the entirety right when it came out. Okay, so there's no box office stuff obviously because it wasn't released, but it is very popular. It was number 1, although it was taken over by Bly Manor, I believe, which is fantastic if you haven't seen that yet. It's gonna do quite well. Millions of people are gonna watch it all over the world. Another thing to think about too with the Netflix deal, and the head of content also said this, is that, Adam Sandler in the United States is one thing, but actually he's bigger in Latin America. And so like that was part of their international expansion, was like Adam Sandler kind of fit that mold of a real global star where like people down in Brazil and Argentina love him, perhaps even more than they do in the United States. So that's another sort of factor here to look at, that like, Netflix USA is one thing, but these things play all over the world now and they're a global company. So he's going to have a hit, I think, throughout the entire world, which is exactly what Netflix is looking for. What about these critics? I mean, like the criticals, like the positive ones. I'm like, what are you talking about? Jake Coyle from Associated Press. The jokes aren't often Sandler's best material, but Hubie Halloween is as sweet and easily digestible as a Milky Way.
Yeah,
I mean, is that, you should be fired as a critic for writing that? Like, that's not an actual statement, right?
No, I had to mention that like, did the way, I don't know if all the Netflix Sandler movies are edited and shot this way, but it makes me sick. Like maybe I ate, a Milky Way in one bite at age 36, but it really, like, it's just ugly. It just does not feel good. Oh. It's like I mentioned, it feels like low rent sitcom style, but even like a low rent sitcom doesn't have like the insane pacing issues that some of the cuts and weird like sound mixing that this movie had. It those aren't the things that usually, bug me, but it just felt so, I don't know, it just like really distorted in a way that did not feel organic at all. And
No, it's shoddy and low rent, the whole thing.
yeah.
Through and through.
On the flip of that, I really like Jesse Hassenge's review from AV Club.
It's a really good review.
It's really good. He says, did Adam Sandler invent the Netflix aesthetic, not the auteur-driven cinema that produced award-winning movies like Irishman, Marriage Story, blah, blah, blah. But, and this is really where I think he hits the nail on his head, the haze of half-assed streaming content caught somewhere between the intersection of movies, TV, and time-killing YouTube videos that defines much of the company's output. And I never really thought about comparing it to YouTube videos, but that kind of explains a lot of like those quick cuts that just feel really gross and jarring, as well as just the kind of like, it almost feels like a YouTube production, like a high-end, like they're using promotional merchandise, going back to like his roots of the Dunkin' Donuts branding in Jack and Jill. Like, yeah, it really does. It feels more like a weird like unboxing commercial, and all you get inside are lukewarm jokes, and it's too bad.
Yeah, and I love the kind of the end of that review from the AV Club. Yet there's something half satisfying and pacifying about Hubie Halloween. In true content blurry Netflix fashion, Sandler has essentially made a likable children's movie to babysit undemanding adults. And it's like, I mean, like perfect bullseye. Because what's funny is I actually watched this movie twice.
Why?
I watched it once just to sort of get it, and then watched it again. And that there is a sort of, there is really a pacifying element to it. It's non-content content. It is definitely something that if you're working on a spreadsheet for work, you could put it on your other screen and like watch it, but not really see anything. And it just keeps your attention enough so you don't get bored doing the spreadsheet is basically what it is. And you know, I don't know, he's got 4 more movies coming up with Netflix. He's not going away. The Sandlerverse is here to stay for forever. And it's just, I just find it to be one of the more bizarre and fascinating elements of the movie production business now, that you got this guy in an era where stars aren't supposed to be important, but you got this guy who's a star, like a super producer, and almost, you know, head of a production studio here. He's just kind of an anomaly. And then he could have won Best Actor last year easily for a role in an art, like a super arty film. He's just all over the place. So I'm gonna write a book on him. That's what I'm gonna do.
And then he said, I think that's one of the things people keep grimacing and waiting for is when he didn't get a nomination for Uncut Gems, he said he was going to unleash the worst movie ever made on the public. And people were, you know, thinking it might be Hubie, but Hubie was mostly filmed before last year's Oscars. So maybe that's what he'll be diving into next.
I think it's possible. The thing that I always come back to is like, I always try to get to like the bottom of why a person is doing what they're doing. Like, why is he making these terrible films over and over again? And like, I always go back to him getting fired at SNL. I feel like something happened when he got fired, and he's just doing this entire thing out of spite. Almost to like prove to the rest of the world and everybody else that, no, I am the most powerful man in comedy, not Lorne Michaels. It's a revenge plot, the whole thing. In any event, if you want to have, if you want to be mollified, I think that's the right term, watch Hubie Halloween. It is boring, childish. I don't even know. I can't recommend it. Would you recommend it? No.
Oh, hell no.
No. And not even for kids. It had a weird middle ground where it didn't really seem like it was for kids. Like the shirts that June Squibb was wearing. It's like, what?
Yeah. And I mean, there's a dick joke in the opening scene, and it's just, it is this weird space where it's not trying hard enough to shock you, but it's also doesn't have any interest in being family friendly.
Oh man, it's a tax dodge, isn't it? In any event, what is coming up next week? It is your selection.
My selection for an old movie that is new to streaming. I'm super excited about it because I don't think I've seen it since I was watching my sister's HBO subscription back in '97 or so. It's the 25th anniversary of Roger Donaldson's sci-fi horror schlockfest Species, starring Natasha Henstridge, Forrest Whitaker, and many others. It's new to streaming on Amazon Prime Video this month, and it'll be a good tie-in for, maybe I would argue, one of the more underrated choices for Halloween viewing that I would highly recommend to everybody before you check out our episode next week.
It is one of my favorite films from that era. I absolutely love Species. It is definitely a schlock fest. So definitely listen to that. Thanks for listening today. This has been Film Trace.